Good evening, guys, and welcome out to Revolution. And so this video is called a reaction video, Erasmus and the manuscripts he used, Steve Combs, King James Bible Research Council. And so I listened to this when it first came out. It was on a different YouTube channel, something to do with Calvary Baptist Church, I think it was. And they seem to just have back-to-back videos. So I think I went through the whole conference in a couple of days. But they've just released this one on the King James Bible Research Council YouTube channel. And so I thought I'd go through this and do a reaction video. So it's not actually a critique in a sense of, well, I guess it is a critique, but it is not being critical of Steve Combs. What it is basically I'm in agreement with the majority of what he said. And I was actually excited to hear him talk about Erasmus and talk about some of the lesser known aspects about Erasmus and the details surrounding his contribution to the Greek Bible and to the Latin Bible and to the Textus Receptus. And so I think this is a really good video. And I thought, well, while people are talking about this and thinking about it, I'll throw my 5 cents worth in and I'll go through and check this video out and do a live reaction. Now, as I said, I have listened to this before, and so I know what the contents are. There were only a few little places where I was like, oh, I'm not really sure about that. But as we go through, I'll look them up. But there are other things I was surprised about and I didn't know myself. And so I think this is a really good video to go through. So this video is better than most about Erasmus. And there are a few things that I guess they can be speculative, but I do this myself. Like say Bessarion, he had a ton of manuscripts in Venice around the time that Erasmus was in Venice. Aldus Manutius was printing Greek texts in Venice. And so to me, it just makes sense that they would have known about these manuscripts and would have ventured into the place that Bessarion kept his manuscripts in. So his library, which is sort of like a museum now, it has, I think at the time they had like 500 manuscripts, not all of them biblical. And so, of course, if you're like the world leading expert in printing Greek text like Aldus Manutius was, you're going to be very interested in that. And also Erasmus, who lived with Aldus for 9 months and was proofreading for him, he would have been interested in that as well, you know, to do. And it's not just the New Testament. These guys were printing and publishing a lot of material in the Greek language, in the Latin language. And so, yeah, I thought, well, I'll go through this. I don't think there's anything else to really talk about or to announce. I think I'll just get straight into this. So basically in this video, Dr. Combs, Steve Combs, I hope I'm saying his name properly, Combs, maybe Combs. It could be the Australian accent that gets it wrong. But so he pushes back on the idea that Erasmus just threw together a bunch of Greek New Testament manuscripts from a handful of late manuscripts. And, you know, he didn't really have access to much, you know, this type of thing. But he does overstate a few things. And I guess speculation, it's good because it requires us to have further investigation. And so in this video, what I really want to do is I want to focus on the strong points that he has said and sort of applaud them. But if there's any little loose ends that I can contribute in and tidy up, I'll try and let people know that information. And even just if you know, Steve Combs, he mightn't get much pushback on this or much like critique on this type of video. because critical text people will just go, no, Erasmus used 5 manuscripts. You know, Dan Wallace says that all the time, and it's just ridiculous. And so this hinders true history, because that they just don't want the other team, the other football team, to have any ground. They're just gonna say, no, that was a foul, we deserve a free kick or whatever. They're not going to just be honest and just say, oh yeah, well, I guess he did have access to Lorenzo Valla's work. He did have access to all of Aldus Manutius's work. Yes, he did have access to Vaticanus. Yeah, many times they're not saying this openly. Like, if you look at the details, people will say this, but then when they're on TV, you know, popular apologists, you know, James White, Dan Wallace, etc., they'll just say, yeah, Erasmus hardly had anything. But the strange thing is, too, when you press like James White, he'll say Erasmus had between, he had 6 manuscripts, and then he had between 6 and 12, then he had up to 20. It's like, so they have no idea. Like, if I just said 80, like, I think, what was it, 83 manuscripts? I think he was saying, no, 58, sorry, manuscripts that, so I instead of saying Coombs, every time I say Coombs, I'm checked that I'm saying it wrong. So maybe I'll just say Steve, okay? So this is no disrespect to him being a doctor or a pastor or anything. I'm just going to say, okay, Steve said this and Steve said that, just to make the video flow better. And so, but yeah, he's saying there was about 58 manuscripts that he could have had access to. So we're going to go through that, and we're going to check those claims out, and we're just going to, you know, Google around a bit as we're going. And yeah, if you have any comments and any questions, or you want to research on the side as we're going through, feel free to do that. So Chris Yetzer says, good to see you, Chris Yetzer. I haven't seen the full video yet. It will be nice to see it along with what you have to say. I'm not sure I'll be able to watch it all today, but looking forward to it, yes. And I do realize this is a strange time to be doing a video here in Australia. It's just after 8 o'clock at night. But when I saw this, I thought, no, I really do want to talk about this. I was actually excited when I listened to this, because that there is a lot. I guess I've studied a lot about Erasmus. When you hear someone talk about something that is your own passion as well, you go, yes. And I thought, well, I may as well do a video on this and talk about it. Lloyd Crooks is in the house. Good to see you. Do you have the link for the full video? Yes, I can grab that here and put it up. And so that's there. And Lloyd, I'll just let you know, I listened to your video on the Textus Receptus, and it was good. I enjoyed that. I think, were you previously a Potter's House guy like myself? I'm pretty sure that you were. It would be good to do something to have a chat about some of these things. And I enjoyed your video talking about, you know, the Trinitarian Bible Society and even Jeff Riddle, how he says that he basically follows the major editions of the TR. But Timothy Decker was sort of saying that, or I think he had like 20 editions of the TR. So I've gone through some of Timothy Decker's material as well. And yeah, it's interesting. I guess in a way there is an advantage. He has gone through and done a lot of homework for us, because he's gone through a bunch of TR editions, and sometimes we have to go through those weeds. But if he's doing it, you know, but like you were saying, it is a bit disingenuous when someone like Jeff Riddle saying we follow like 4 TRs or 3 TRs or whatever he follows. I think it was Stephanus Beza and Elzevir or something like that. And yeah, the Trinitarian Bible Society was sort of saying the same thing. And for Timothy Decker to say what he said about it, it did seem like it was a bit, you know, bit strange. And I guess a lot of people are influenced by Mark Ward, and he tends to say, oh, there's 28 different texti recepti and all this sort of stuff. But one interesting thing is, I'm pretty sure Timothy Decker is actually a majority text guy. He's not a critical text guy. So that's sort of interesting to know, because But the thing is, a lot of majority text guys use critical text methodologies in their studies. And so, but yeah, good to see you in the house. Gentile Dog is in the house and says it's after 6 a.m. here in Florida, joining in before work. Hi, Nick. Good to see you, Gentile Dog. You get the crumbs from the table. Okay, so let's jump into this. I'll go straight to the beginning. And whoops, where are we? That's, my mouse is sticky. Yes, Erasmus and the manuscripts he used, Dr. Steve Combs, King James Bible Research Council. Let's get into this. I'll make sure I'm not muted. Here we go.
We're going to be looking first of all at a verse of...
I better not have it on double speed. Maybe 1.25. Okay, let's do it.
Scripture. And then I'll introduce our subject. And I want you to look at Isaiah chapter 46, starting at verse 9. Remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is none else. I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand. You better go to the next one. My counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. Calling, see if I did that right. There we go. Okay. Calling a ravenous bird from the east, the man that executeth my counsel from a far country. Yea, I have spoken it, I will also bring it to pass. I have purposed it, I will also do it. And when I look at these verses, there is one phrase that comes to mind. God is the God of history. Now, it isn't like the Calvinists tell us, and that is that God decreed all things that whatsoever would come to pass before he ever created the world. That is, you stub your toe, predestinated before the foundation of the world. That's not what we're talking about here. But the fact is that God has a plan for history. God knows how to bring his plan to pass, and God is capable of bringing his plan to pass. And whatever resources God needs to accomplish his purpose, he's able to do it. Notice that verse 11, calling a ravenous bird from the east, the man that executeth my counsel from a far country. Now, one of those people that God called from a far country was a man named Desiderius Erasmus. He was a Dutchman, born in 1466, or some say 1467. There's a little bit of uncertainty there, but he died in 1536. Now, one of the most important accomplishments of this man was that he was the very first to publish a printed edition of the New Testament, the Greek New Testament. And he did that in 1516. And he followed it up with additional editions in 1519, 1522, 1527, and 1533. So he didn't just do that work in 1 or 2 years. He continued on for 20 years after the first edition, and he was working on it a long time before that. And that's what we're going to talk about this morning. Now, one of the...
Okay, so one thing, when I was listening to this, I was like, yes, that's true. Yes, that's true. Yes, that, like all the way through. And I guess it's when we start getting into some of the fine details that there are a few little things that I've learned over the years, or I've just read that are sometimes rare. Even sometimes going through the books that Erasmus wrote, like people say he rushed to print, for example. He rushed to print, and then but at the same time, in 1515, I think it was, in 1518, 1522, and he's writing other books. So this whole rush to print thing, like it was, the thing was, a lot of people don't like, they don't respect the fact that it took 1,000. I listened to a video that I did recently. I said there was 100 Greek characters, but I actually meant 1,000 when I said it. There's 1,000 Greek characters. And so if you look at, say, the Greek alphabet, let me just grab the Greek alphabet up. Now, this is a great site if you need to get Greek letters for, if you're doing a project or you're writing something out. Now, we've got the Greek alphabet in Wikipedia, but if you just go down through it, there's quite a lot of variations between some of these letters, but probably the biggest one is down the bottom, and I'm often going here, and you see all these type of rough breathing, smooth breathing, acute symbols on it. You've got the iota subscript underneath and this type of thing. So all of these letters had to be available in the time of Erasmus. So Aldus Manutius, he had made his print shop, but other people around Europe were starting to cotton onto that. But they had to have 1,000 of these, and you had to make them by hand. You can't just ring up and get them ordered from Temu or something. This was a lot of work. And so all of this type of thing had to have been done as well. So when you're looking at Erasmus and what he's done, when they're saying, they're rushing to print, I mean, it's not like he just gave it to a publisher and said, that's it. He would have been working with that type of thing. And being a proof reader for Aldus Manutius, the most famous publisher of Greek material ever, he would have known what went into all this. And so there are errors in his first edition, 1516. Like if you look at the numbering system at the top, especially if you go to the Book of Revelation, you'll see it just drops like 50 numbers. So it's like 675, but then it says 625. And it just keeps counting on from there. So someone's just made a mistake like that. Those type of things, like sometimes you really got to be careful that these critical text scholars, they grab something that Erasmus has said, and many times it's out of context, and many times he's not really talking about something that they're saying he's talking about. He could be talking about many other things. It could be related to just the way that it was printed, or that it had errors in it like that, numbering errors and things, just typos. And he's like, imagine looking at all these, and when you're printing, these are all backwards. So imagine having, this rough breathing or a smooth breathing, which is just a comma going one way or the other, and an iota subscript and a little accent mark at the top or up here going left to right, or a little sort of tilde type of thing. I mean, that's hard. And you had to do it with a mirror. That's hard work. This would be hard just to do in Microsoft Word, let alone doing it with actual like tiny little uppercase, lowercase type of thing going on. But anyway, I just sort of show you that. And so KW says, "Oh, how Canadian of you." Yeah, I was just saying, because he said he's from Ontario. There's an interesting song by a guy called Lightfoot. He's a Canadian sort of folk singer, and I listened to his song, the Edmund Fitzgerald, which is it's an amazing song about a shipwreck. And so if you ever get time to Google that, it's an epic, sounds like an Irish folk song actually. And he's just saying, "How Canadian of you. I'm Cliff, Brian's friend, yet another mid-axe retiree." And so obviously knows Bryan Ross and saw the link on the TR Academy. And so if you have access to Facebook, we run the Textus Receptus Academy. Lots of guys who are TR guys, King James guys, jump on there and post stuff. And I do try to get rid of the junk. There's lots of people just putting up, pray if you love Jesus and all this stuff. And it's like, yeah, that's great, but we want to talk about the TR. And so, jump on board. We're nearly at 10,000 people on there, which is really cool. And it's very interactive. So if you ask questions there, usually a bunch of people will jump on and answer. Yes, there are people who will jump on and say, if you don't believe the King James is the true word of God, you're going to hell or something. You will get people like that, and you'll get critical text people say that, the King James is terrible. But if you can get past that. I do try to moderate that, but I can't read everything with 10,000 people on there. But yeah, it's a great fun place to be. Okay, so let's continue on with Steve's teachings.
Incidents in my own life took place about 2 years ago. I was in a Sunday school class, and there was a fellow who was teaching about where we got our English Bible. And as he taught, I listened to him for a little while, and I realized that if Westcott and Hort were in the class, they would have been beaming with pride over this gentleman, because what he was teaching was what they taught. And he got to the point where he was talking about Erasmus and how he printed the Greek New Testament, and that Greek New Testament became known as the Textus Receptus. And he said about Erasmus that it is unfortunate that Erasmus only had a few late manuscripts. It is very unfortunate. And that's what's always said about Erasmus. It's a constant refrain. It's repeated from daylight to dark. Erasmus only had a few manuscripts, and they were late. Now, what that means is that they were young in his day. The oldest copy he had was dated in the 9th century. And that's in the 800s somewhere. And the rest of them were younger. Some of them were really young. They had just been copied in the 1400s. So they couldn't be very accurate manuscripts because they were so young.
And so usually what I hear is that Erasmus didn't have anything before the 12th century. And I'm not saying, that's true or not, but that's just what the critical text people will say. They will say that. And also they'll say, well, Codex Montfortianus was made in 1520. It was sort of made to order for the Commuhanium's inclusion in his 1522 edition. Okay. So that's usually one of the manuscripts. It's like, well, it was just made on the spot, which I guess because I've studied that quite a lot, that's why I'm bringing that up. And I understand he's talking about the 1516 edition. But just if you go a few years, because the 1516, 1519 editions didn't have the Commuhanium in it, because every single reading that Erasmus has in his Greek New Testament had Greek manuscript evidence. See, a lot of people don't teach that, or they don't know that, or they're told, oh, he back translated from the Latin whenever he wanted. And so this is a fabrication, because if that was the case, he just would have put the Commuhanium in because it was there in 95% of the Latin manuscripts that are around. And so, but obviously Erasmus wanted it to be in a Greek manuscript. He wanted his readings to be in Greek. And so he said, look, I've looked at lots of different things, and we see that today. There's hardly any Greek manuscripts with 1 John 5:7 in it. So that's why there's a controversy over that. But when you study into it, you can see that unfaithful scribes, this is what Jerome said, unfaithful scribes were deleting that verse. And so that's a very interesting thing that Jerome said. It's in the Latin. It's in the preface to 1 John, to the what's called the Catholic epistles. And so Codex Montfortianus, they say it was made to order sort of thing, where if you actually read Erasmus's annotations and you compare them to Codex Montfortianus, it's a completely different manuscript that Erasmus is talking about. Erasmus is talking about Codex Britannicus, and people just say Codex Montfortianus is Codex Britannicus. They just say that. But when you look at the details, they're very different at 1 John 5:7. And people just say, oh, Erasmus just made a mistake and he just wrote the wrong letters, and he was an idiot sort of thing. It's amazing how many of these anecdotes about Erasmus and Beza and Stephanus and King James translators, it comes down to them being idiots, just slipping on a banana peel, or being like the Three Stooges. It's quite annoying to listen to that type of rhetoric. But I just sort of mentioned that. And also with the last 12 the last 6 verses of Revelation, people say they are back translated from the Latin. Now, Erasmus did back translate from the Latin in one particular place, and he said it was in verse 19, and he spotted homoioteliton in the Greek copies, in the plural Greek copies, okay? And he amended the reading there. He said it was parablepsis, which is homoioteliton is a type of parablepsis, which is basically when you get to the end of the line, it might have the same word like book, and they've skipped a few lines, and then they've continued on so that they've omitted words. Now, the modern critical text guys, or a guy called Franz Delitzsch, like 300 years after Erasmus, found a manuscript and said, I think this is what Erasmus used, but it's missing 6 verses at the end, not just a few words like Erasmus said. Oh, Erasmus must be a liar. And everywhere else in the manuscript, it's very different to Erasmus's. Oh, he was back translating from the Latin everywhere and just didn't tell us. Instead of believing Erasmus's own words and what he clearly said, and his generation would have been very judgmental about what he did and what he said. These guys, years later, Franz Delitzsch, he worked on the Textus Receptus. Or in a sense where he did a Hebrew edition from the TR. I know the Trinitarian Bible Society are doing sort of like videos on him at the moment and talking about him. So that's an interesting thing. But yeah, him and Tregelles, they basically said, yeah, Erasmus lied. And this actually caused a lot of people to distrust the Textus Receptus and to distrust what Erasmus had said himself. But clearly Erasmus said it was a few words. It was around verse 19. And how on earth can you spot homoioteliton in verse 19 if the 6 verses from verse 16 to verse 21 are missing? That's impossible. So that you either Erasmus is lying or modern scholars just have the wrong manuscript. And that's happened before plenty of times. And so, like I said, Codex Montfortianus is not Codex Britannicus. The details differ. And also the codex that they claim is the one that Erasmus used for Revelation. I don't think that's the one. And it has many different readings throughout. And they just say, oh, he back translated from the Latin wherever he wanted. Well, why didn't he do that with the Communihennium then? It wasn't his style. He specifically mentioned in his first edition, Revelation chapter 22, in his 1516 edition, he has an annotation saying in the Greek copies, plural, that he spotted parablepsis. The scribe had just made a mistake. So he back translated from the Latin, and he put that note in his annotations. And what he was doing was waiting for the guys from the Aldine press who were also working on New Testament edition, a New Testament edition with the Old Testament Greek, the entire Septuagint. So it was a whole Greek Bible, Septuagint and New Testament. And he was waiting for them with their manuscripts that they had of Revelation, and he wanted to adjust it according to what they had. So he wanted to be very careful to make sure that everything was based upon Greek. Now, if you read his 1516, it has that note. Every edition after that doesn't have that note. Why? Because they fixed it. And so this is just simply what happened. So I just thought I'd throw that in there because a lot of people don't know that. I've studied those 2 specific issues at length, and I know quite a lot about it. I'll debate on it. I'm debate ready for those issues. But I just thought I'd mention them just in case someone enjoyed this lecture and they just want a few little extra crumbs of all I'm doing is your Dr. Coombs has put out the food. I'm just putting a bit of salt on it. Yeah, I'm just putting a bit of garnishing on it and just saying, yeah, and also this, so.
And there were only a very few of them. Well, that's what's told about Erasmus. And so the objections are what we're going to talk about this morning or this afternoon. And it boils down to what were Erasmus manuscripts? What was the material he used the source material to produce a Greek New Testament in printed form. Now you understand that up to this point in history, all the copies of the New Testament were handwritten, and that's what we call manuscripts. The originals were handwritten. All the copies were handwritten from the 1st century all the way actually to the 16th century. The last handwritten manuscripts were done. And there's actually been a few since. But up until the printing of the printing press, that's all they had. And the movable type printing press was invented and started to be used about 1450. Just a few years before Erasmus was born. It was brand new technology. The New Testament had never been produced on a printing press ever before.
Sorry, I muted myself. I was opening up my soda water there and made a big fizzy sound. Yeah, this is a very important thing to understand, because a lot of people, like when it comes to, say, Westcott and Houghton, what they did what the New Testament that they did, they printed that, they pushed it out because they had basically Sinaiticus. Okay, Vaticanus had been around. It became more and more popular, and more and more access was available to Vaticanus, and then Sinaiticus. So they had a different methodology and a different way of doing textual criticism, and so that's what they wanted to do. It wasn't the case in the Reformation period. In the Reformation period, it was just a new technology came along. It's like say the internet came along, and someone just wanted to put it on the internet, sort of thing. So Erasmus was like, okay, we've got printing. Let's, instead of having it in manuscripts, let's put it into print. Now, he used the Byzantine text. The vast majority of his text is just backed up by Byzantine manuscripts. And so the thing is, with the critical text, it's just done sort of in the middle of nowhere, with no real main reason to do it, except for an affinity all of a sudden for Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, where naturally everything was becoming printed. All the works that Aldus Manutius was working on, and he was working on like the Odyssey and a lot of Greek works, and so he was just simply grabbing those, getting the best manuscripts that he could possibly get, and going through and putting that into print form. And so that's all Erasmus was doing, was just getting available Greek texts and putting it into a printed form. Now, he was very skilled in Latin and in Greek, and we're going to Dr. Coombs goes through this. I know I said I'd call him Steve, but now I'm calling him Dr. Coombs. But yeah, so this whole issue of the technology change, it just took a little while for things to get ironed out. So Erasmus did 5 editions. Obviously, if he thought his first edition was it, and he didn't care about accuracy like some critical texts claim, why would he do all these other editions? Why would he keep compiling manuscripts? Like Frederick Nolan in 1815 states, in addition to the manuscripts which Erasmus owned or had seen himself, he gathered readings from the whole of Europe through his broad friendships. He noted, I have a room full of letters from men of learning. We find by the dates of his letters that he was corresponding at length and elaborately with the learned men of his time on technical points of scholarship and biblical criticism. And so he was talking with the Complutensian polyglot guys. A lot of the people who were helping him on his first edition ended up being reformers in Europe. And so he didn't like the radicalness of Luther, but he still corresponded with him and talked with him about certain issues. And Erasmus was respected, but like Luther used his New Testament to do his edition. So Erasmus, when he was in Italy, he spent all of his time devouring the libraries. So this is This is the testimony of Durant, comparing two codices for the more correct reading of some intricate passage was his passion. Erasmus states, "It may easily be guessed how large a part of the usefulness of my work would have been lacking if my learned friends had not supplied me with manuscripts." And so the usual critical text story is that you just got this scholar who's really sort of disinterested in the Bible. Like James White will say, oh, he's only just with the book of Revelation, he didn't really care much about it. In fact, he didn't even know that he didn't think that John wrote it. They say things like this, but actually when you go back to the source that James White claims on that, he's citing Jan Kranz, who wrote Beyond What Is Written, which is a critique of Erasmus and Beza and their textual criticism. And he's looking for, conjectural emendations and things like that. But James White uses Jan Kranz's saying where Jan Kranz actually he purposely mistranslates a Latin term, olim. Okay. The word olim means that the book of Revelation had formerly been attributed sort of as anonymous, like they didn't know who wrote it. Erasmus is talking about the Greeks. The Greeks were like, we don't know who wrote Revelation. And that's just a historical fact. But by changing the word olim there, Jan Kranz actually says Erasmus didn't know, really didn't have any confidence that John had written Revelation. And so James White has, he talks about this quite a lot and says, well, Erasmus didn't care about the book of Revelation. He didn't even think that John wrote it. And he just gets these little sound bites, basically makes out that Erasmus didn't care. He was just flippant about it. And so it's kind of, I guess in a way sad to see that that's how James White interprets the work that Erasmus did. Where when you look at the work that Erasmus did, he did a lot of very hard work on the text. He respected the texts. And if you actually just, all you have to do is skip what Jan Kranz has said there and just go to Erika Rummel, even though she's a critical text person, she's very clear that it's talking about the Greeks and not Erasmus himself. And so I thought that was worth talking about. Okay, so let's just continue.
That is the Greek New Testament. Now, the Latin Vulgate used by the Catholic Church, that had been printed, but the Greek New Testament had never been published before, 1516. Now, there was another one that was being worked on at the same time in Spain, and it goes by the grandiose title, the Complutensian Polyglot. It was a Bible in 4 languages, including a Greek New Testament, and it was printed 2 years before Erasmus, 1514, but it was not published and issued to the public. It was private printing. So Erasmus was the first Greek New Testament to be printed.
So the Complutensian Polyglot, there was certain aspects to that where when the New Testament was done, there was also like a Hebrew dictionary type of thing done as well. And so you sort of had to sell the whole thing in one block. I guess it's like getting a study Bible and they've done like the New Testament and the Minor Prophets or something. And it's like, it's not the full thing. And let's just wait until we finish the rest of the Old Testament and then we'll put it all together. And so I think sometimes it can be blown out of proportion that, Erasmus had sort of, he had, sway because of Pope Leo X. He had publishing rights. I think that can be blown out of proportion where when you look at the Complutensian Polyglot guys, they had access to the Pope. They had access to a lot of his material. manuscripts were lent to the Complutensian guys from the Vatican. So they had access to a lot of things that Erasmus most probably didn't. But I guess later on he did through their scholarship. You know, they had worked on a whole bunch of things. And so we've got Heffron Jones in the house, who I've interviewed him on this platform. So g'day, Heffron, in Australia. And so Heffron says the New Testament of the Complutensian was the easiest part for them to print. And Nick's basically right. It took time to complete the rest of the volumes. Yeah, so I think it came out in 6 parts. I might be wrong about that, but usually it's seen as like a 2-part thing. You got the New Testament and with a Hebrew dictionary sort of thing and with other helps. It's quite a huge book, and I guess it would be a very interesting thing to go through and nut out some of the details of it. It's and it's quite easy to read the Greek. It's in a really nice font. But yeah, so I thought I'd mention that.
And from the day it was printed to this day, it has never ceased to be criticized. And it's always criticized by people who present themselves as knowing more than Erasmus knew. I don't know more than Erasmus knew. Let me tell you a little bit about this man. This man was how do you describe him? It takes, if you sat down and just wrote out a list of all of the works he published in his life, it would go on for column after column after column after column. And it wasn't all biblical stuff. Some of it was classical writers. Some of it was those early writers we call church fathers. It was a lot of varied things, and some of it was original writing on his part. But Erasmus was put in a Catholic school at a young age, and his parents died, very likely from the Black Plague. And Erasmus and his brother inherited a little bit of money. It never was very much, but he had 3 guardians. And one bowed out, one died, and it left a third one who ended up squandering their money. So they were penniless and broke in this Catholic school, and they were told, you've only got one course. Go to a monastery and become a priest. And both boys said no. And the pressure was put on them. It was like they were ground into the dirt every day with pressure to become priests. And Erasmus' brother gave in first and went to a monastery and was trained as a priest. And finally, when he was so miserable, he couldn't take it any longer, he ran away from the monastery, got involved in some bad things, and according to Erasmus, died in what he called dissipation, whether that was moral degradation or alcohol or whatever it was, but he died miserably. Erasmus continued to resist until he was finally told, hey, they've got libraries and monasteries, and you can have all the access to the libraries that you want. And if you give it a try, you can get out of it later. Ha, 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 ha. That's not how it worked. Once they had you for life. So he said, okay. So he was put in the monastery. He was ordained as a priest. He never functioned as a priest. And fortunately, in the will of God, he was allowed to leave the monastery and become a secretary to a bishop. And from there, he was sent by the bishop with a small, tiny allowance to the University of Paris, where he began studying for his education. And he continued on until 1499, and he basically spent his entire life traveling all over Europe. So Erasmus is criticized for having only a few late manuscripts that were considered to be inferior. And they were, therefore, his Greek New Testament was also considered to be inferior. Now, as I mentioned, he published.
And so Heaven Jones says, might have to just dip in and out. I was curious to hear your reaction to Dr. Coombs. I am hoping we can see his notes and his slides. Yeah, I think he is showing slides in the background. I saw a picture of Erasmus earlier, but I don't think they showed this during this video. So, and so I was just reading here. It says in Erasmus in 1498, so around 1499 is what Dr. Coombs was talking about. It says here that in England, he lived in England on 3 separate occasions. He first was there in 1505. He associated with Thomas More, John Colet, and Hugh Latimer. Now, they're all very big names in the English church at that time. He also met with King Henry VIII, and he wrote Praise of Folly in 1509. And so it's quite interesting to see in Paris, he was tutoring and doing things, but then he went to England, and that seems to be where he's, he was hanging around people in Cambridge, and Greek was exploding. People were talking about all sorts of different things. He had Fontes, concept was spreading, and I guess the Renaissance was happening, and so there were a few places where this was exploding. Cambridge was one place, Rome was another. And so Erasmus, he was in England, he was in Italy, he was in Venice, he was in a whole bunch of places in Paris, and he traveled around quite a bit. And so
the New Testament in 1516. He finished his studies in Paris in 1499 and went to England. But in 1516, the mythology is that he arrived in Basel, Switzerland in 1515, about a year earlier, and he found, at first they said 5 manuscripts, and they've upped that. They know now it was 8 manuscripts. He found those there. And with those 8 late manuscripts, he created the entire Greek New Testament in a year and had it published.
And so that's one of the things I've often said is Dan Wallace will adamantly thump the table and say, no, he had 5 manuscripts. And then he will say, Westcott and Hort used 2,000 manuscripts. And today we're using 5,000. I'm just like, no. Westcott and Hort rejected the Byzantine manuscripts and didn't want to use them. And so, of course, he didn't use 2,000. But that's, Dan Wallace obviously been caught out a few times saying these type of numbers. And this is one of the things, like I've been harsh on Steve Coombs for saying about P52 and it, when I examined that, it had the Westcott and Hort reading in it instead of the Textus Receptus reading in it. And I just thought, no, that's a bit, it's sort of the opposite of what's being said. But really that pales into, it's really quite insignificant when you look at Dan Wallace, who's supposed to be, one of the world leading experts on the New Testament, saying that Westcott and Hort used 2,000 Greek manuscripts. It's like, no. And even critical text people were like, yeah, he really said that. It was in the Ankerberg debate right at the end. If you watch the last 10 minutes, you'll see him say it. And then he just turns around and says, yeah, the Nestle Alarm text uses 5,000 manuscripts. And it's like, huh? No, they don't. Maybe people are trying to collate these things for an apparatus and things, but they're not using it for their main text. But then he's adamant, no, Erasmus used 5 manuscripts. And so it just seems like, it's like politics. If you're a Democrat or a Republican, you're just going to say the worst thing about the other side or your football team, whatever. But it's not honest scholarship. And, I can understand, when the P52 issue sort of came out, it was like, that he's wrong on that. But, really, compared to what Dan Wallace has been saying, and he keeps saying this stuff over and over and over, it's hardly anything. It's like a little blip. But what I've found, and I've said this so many times, is James White will say there's 6 manuscripts that back up the Textus Receptus. But then after a while, he started saying between 6 and 12. It's like, okay, which is it? And then, like, I think it was Stephen Boyce said there was like 8, between 8 and 10 or something like that, or 8 and 11. And then James White was pressed on the Wretched program, and he said there'd be up to 20 manuscripts that Erasmus had access to. And I'm like, which is it? Because if it can vary that much, if 1 minute it can be 5, and the next minute James White is saying, no, there's 4 times as many. So if I say he had access to 800, you know, I'm just pulling numbers out of the sky. And so, this is problematic because people are very dogmatic about this. A lot of arguments on the internet about the Textus Receptus include, well, Erasmus only had access to a handful of, late manuscripts, this type of thing. And so, anyway, let's continue.
That is true mythology. It never happened. Not that way. He did find the 8 manuscripts, which he used in addition to many, many others that he had found over the previous 10 years while traveling Europe.
And that's something that I try and emphasize. Erasmus was going around Europe looking at manuscripts. Now, they don't give away manuscripts. It's not like you go there and you get a souvenir. You go to a library, you can look at a manuscript, and then you leave the manuscript behind. Like you try and get some manuscripts and put them in your possession. They're worth a fortune, and back then they were worth a lot of money. I mean, some of these manuscripts, they took a year for one guy to write out. They're worth a lot of money. So if they're sitting in the library, they're not just going to hand them out. So Erasmus would sit there, look at these. He might spend a couple of days looking at a certain document and just skimming over it, writing down certain variants. Obviously, you wouldn't just copy everything out, but you would write down variants. Now, there was a time, I'll just try and get this. I'll let Dr. Coombs continue, and I'll just find this quotation, because there was a period in Erasmus's life where all of his works were confiscated. And it's interesting to see what he says about them. But I'll try and find that on the side here.
So Erasmus went many places, and I hope you can see this okay, but it's a little map where the stars indicate the places where he traveled to. He was in France for a number of years. He was in Belgium for a number of years. He was in England for a number of years. He was in Switzerland. He was in Germany. He was in Italy. He traveled all over Western Europe. And when he went to Italy, finally, in 1506, and he was there for 3 years, he went to several cities. And if you can see the stars there, up at the top, I think it's your left or right, is the city of Turin. When he went there, they gave him, the University of Turin gave him a doctor's degree. And then he went to Venice and visited Aldus Manutius, the famous printer there, who had 1,000 Greeks working for him.
Now, when I first heard this, I was like, no, 1,000? I'd heard he had 40, and so it's a bit of a difference. We want to be careful about this, so I'm going to do this in real time. I'm going to get maybe Grok. I'll get Grok, and I'll ask Grok about this. How many Greeks did Aldus Manutius have working for him in Venice? And I'll put 40 or 1,000 question mark. Okay. neither 40 or 1,000. It's around 30 speakers employed by the Aldine Press. So I'll just put this up here. Now, I don't usually sign on to Grok, so it probably doesn't have much in my algorithm either. I use ChatGPT, and I've recently paid because I was using it so often. It would just say, "Oh, you've hit your limit," and it's like, "Oh, okay." And I found I was using it a lot, so it's like, well, I may as well pay for it. So I'll just read through this. So it says, according to reliable historical accounts, including Aldus Manutius's Wikipedia entry, drawing on biographer Martin Lowry for other sources, Aldus spoke Greek in his household and employed 30 Greek speakers at his printing operations in Venice. So that's what I call the Byzantine school, and that's why I do Byzantine school videos. If you want to know more about the Byzantine school and people around Erasmus, just maybe go to Google, type in Nick Sayers Byzantine school, and videos should come up. They were mostly from Crete, large part of the Greek immigrant community in Venice after the fall of Constantinople. They handled preparing and proofreading Greek manuscripts, provided calligraphy models for the Greek typefaces he developed, correcting proofs, comparing manuscripts, and help edit texts. Why not 40 or 1,000? 40 doesn't appear in primary or secondary sources about Aldus's workforce. So yeah, when I heard this, I was like, I don't think it's 1,000. Now, I know there was 5,000 Greeks at the time living in Venice because the fall of Constantinople had basically just happened, and people could still go there, but it wasn't the same as it used to be. And so, but yeah, a lot of people exodused from Constantinople through to Venice. And the thing was, in Venice, that's where most of they were like an ally to the people in Constantinople. They were relying on ships to come from Venice and save them, but they never really got there on time, and they had their own problems at the time. So it sort of gets political. But yeah, the 1,000 it says here is way off. Aldus's entire operation was a scholarly printing house, not a massive factory. His press produced important first editions like Greek classics like Aristotle, etc. But the workforce was modest: scholars, compositors, and correctors, supplemented by Venice's existing Greek scribal community. And so in the low dozens, not hundreds or thousands. Okay. The New Academy, founded in 1502, was a separate scholarly group Aldus organized to promote Greek studies. That's interesting. Its members, including Erasmus, Pietro Bembio, and several Cretan Greeks like Marcus Marusus, spoke Greek and followed Greek-style rules, but it wasn't his printing staff, more an intellectual circle. Memberships vary, but weren't in the hundreds. Okay. In short, Aldus relied heavily on Greek expertise. Venice had a big expatriate community that supplied manuscripts and talent, but the number directly working for him in the press was about 30, not 40 or anywhere near 1,000. The higher figures seem like an exaggeration or confusions that sometimes pop up in popular retellings. Okay. And so, so to me, that would be, that's, I sort of, when I first heard this, I was like, 1,000. That was the first I'd heard that number. And I guess to me, because I've looked into Aldus's work and how Erasmus worked with him as a proofreader for 9 months and lived with Aldus, and most of the time that those type of numbers were just sort of in the background of the text that I was reading, and it would, for me, 40 was sort of like a number in the background. And I've often said, the Byzantine schools probably had about 40 people in it. So yeah, I would just say that probably needs to be corrected. So I'll just rewind that and we'll just check it out.
They gave him, the University of Turin gave him a doctor's degree, and then he went to Venice and visited Aldus Manutius, the famous printer there, who had 1,000 Greeks working for him, and they had a large Greek community, and Erasmus was there speaking fluent Greek to them
and so that's true.
months. And he had
For at least 9 months, he was a proofreader for Aldus, and he would have been speaking Greek there. They had the Byzantine school there, and Erasmus was seen as a leader there. And so he knew, because he knew grammar so well, he was probably the world-leading expert in the Latin language at the time. And so he was called the Prince of the Humanists. And so going and learning Greek like he did, the whole reason he went to Italy was to learn Greek. So he's there in Italy for 3 years. He was in Venice. He lived with Paulus Bombasius, who was the curator for the Vatican Library. I don't think he was while he lived with him, because he lived with him in, I think it was Bologna, which is just near Venice. But later on, he went to Rome and became the curator for the Vatican Library. I'll try and find that, actually. Maybe I should just read this. This is on my website. Now, I might copy and paste this into the chat if anyone's interested in studying it. It's not, my website isn't just one lovely article all written out perfectly and polished. It's just little bits of crumbs of information I found from everywhere, and I just throw it up there and go, well, there you go. Sometimes it's just like a saying, but I actually started to put things into place, like England and just who he had access to there, and maybe a link to someone writing an article on that. Like the Paris one, obviously it's very basic. I could elaborate on all that, but I'll just quickly read through maybe the Italy and Venice one, because you'll see the importance of this as I read through it. Erasmus visited Italy in 1506 and spent 3 years there. He went to Italy primarily to perfect his knowledge of Greek. He arrived in the town of Bologna in time to witness the triumphal entry of the warrior Pope Julius II at the head of a conquering army, a scene that figures later in Erasmus's anonymously published satiric dialogue, Julius Exclusus e Coelis. And so you can sort of see the puppy feet of, Luther, writing about these things. Erasmus intended to obtain a doctorate from the University of Bologna, but he had not acquired other necessary scholarly titles to gain admission. Thus, he proceeded to the University of Turin and then to Bologna University. He abode with Paulus Bombasius. So that's the Bombasius that was the curator at the Vatican Library, and he had access to Codex Vaticanus and looked at that for the Communianium for Erasmus. So he was the professor of Greek there. So he lived with him for 13 months, so just over a year with Paulus Bombasius. So they obviously got to know each other. This introduced Erasmus to the upper echelon of Greek scholarship of that era. On the 28th of October 1507, Erasmus wrote to Aldus Manutius, the Venetian printer. At this time, Aldus Press had become one of the most prominent printers in Europe and had already produced many Greek works. Erasmus requested that Aldus print his Latin translation of 2 plays of Euripides, and so he talks about those titles. Although both already printed at Paris, Erasmus knew the superior printing of Aldus with his invention of the famous Aldino type or italic would be more favorable. It was in this letter that Erasmus also mentioned the publication of the Greek New Testament, a project Aldus had also said he himself had desired to accomplish. And so in 1506, this is just my own words, 1506, Aldus had actually printed, I think it was 6 chapters of the Gospel of John, which is quite interesting. And so that was on his mind to do that as well. So that was in Greek. So in 1508, Aldus published Erasmus's thousands of proverbs, Adigorum Chilades. Erasmus also visited Rome. And so wouldn't you think if he's visiting Rome, where would he go? probably the Vatican Library. That's why he's there. He's looking at manuscripts. He's looking for rare books. And so very interesting that he would visit at that time. Now, I'll just read this one on Venice, and then we'll get back to the video. But 1 month after writing to Aldus in December of 1507, Erasmus arrived in Venice in January 1508 to see the accomplishment of the printing of his Euripidean plays. Erasmus rose to become one of the greatest Greek linguists of the entire Reformation era. He spent much of his time with Venetian printer Aldus Manutius and Aldus's Greek Academy, which had within it a core of Byzantine scholars. So that's where I get the sort of 30 number from anyone who's sort of talking about that type of thing. Actually, I said 40, so 30 is what Grok's saying. He spent his first 10 months in Venice working as a proofreader at the publishing house, working on such works as Plutarch's Moralia, the first publication of his Adages in Paris in 1500, followed by, and I won't say those Latin words there, in 1504, caused Erasmus to become a well-known scholar. When the Aldine Press published Adages in 1508, this caused Erasmus's reputation as a Greek scholar to be established throughout Europe, as Aldus had aimed to print all of the Greek classics of the ancient world. His research using Manutius's resources and Greek scholars enabled him to expand his collection of proverbs from 819 to 3,260 entries. Like, imagine just writing a book on English proverbs, like It's Raining Cats and Dogs, that sort of thing. What you'll find is the vast majority of English proverbs go back to this book that Erasmus had, because it was published, I think it was in 1540 in English, and that comes from the History of the English Language podcast on Spotify, which I recommend to anyone to listen to. It's very good and very detailed. And so the Aldine Press published this new expanded collection of proverbs, Adagigorum. I won't say the Latin. I'm just embarrassing myself. In 1508, Erasmus stayed at Aldus's house for 7 months, January to September 1508. Okay, I think I was saying 9 months before, so I've just corrected myself there. He shared a room with that guy with the funny name, with the Italian name, I should say, and compiled a lexicon of Greek and Latin in 1512, and an introductory Greek grammar with that big long Latin name, 1509, and edited Greek text by Plutarch, Lucian, 1509 to 1510, and Isocrates. And so that's just him in Venice. So he's had access to all these Greeks. He's had access to all these different manuscripts. And to have 3,260 proverbs, you have to be reading a lot of Greek to get, like, who could figure out those proverbs? You know what I mean? So he was around native Greeks saying this sort of stuff. So it was like we know that once Constantinople fell, a lot of the manuscripts entered into Europe. And so people were all of a sudden looking at a whole bunch of Greek manuscripts. But what we sort of forget too is that a lot of these manuscripts had been read for years and years and years by top-notch scholars. And some of these guys had been in Constantinople or had been influenced by the teachings there. And they were just walking libraries themselves, able to decipher things, able to just, if you're reading through a Greek manuscript, able to point out why they've got these marginal things there. The Eusebian canons and things like that, just explaining everything. And to have someone who has that type of knowledge just to explain everything to you, that's invaluable, because oftentimes we have people in the West explaining this stuff to us, and we're fumbling along. We're sort of like, well, I think it could be this. And I think the thing is too, with text criticism being in the state that it's in today, it causes people to be believe falsehoods about the text. There's so many rumors. There's so many half truths. There's so many people trying to demonize the King James text, or Beza or Erasmus or Stephanus. And so oftentimes that type of thing muddies the water as well. And so anyway, so let's get back to this video.
Began his studies in Greek about 1504. So he had been studying Greek for many years. He didn't just learn it off the bat and get himself an analytical Greek concordance that told you what the grammar was for every Greek word in the New Testament, and all you have to do is look it up and then you can tell what it is. He had it all memorized. He had all the declensions and all the conjugations. They were all memorized. He used them on a daily basis, and he spoke fluent Greek in addition to speaking fluent Latin.
So this stuff is very good information. And so I'll just go through this biblical Greek studies. Erasmus was surrounded with biblical manuscripts from his childhood in the 1460s until the publication of his Greek text in 1516, which is a period of over 40 years. He worked with the text over 12 years on the text itself. He worked for over 12 years on the text itself. The preparation had taken years, it says. And so, just doing the math, he would have been, I think it was 1460s. That was 56 years. And so, he spent quite a lot of it studying Greek, studying the languages. As early as 1505, Erasmus wrote to a friend, "I shall sit down with Holy Scripture with my whole heart and devote the rest of my life to it. All these years, I have been working entirely at Greek and have not been playing with it." So 1505, he's already saying, all these years I've been working with Greek. He began work directly on the text much before 1507. Freud wrote that years before the text appeared, it was being prepared. And this is a quote: "He had been at work over the Greek manuscripts for many years, and work was approaching completion." And so that's in 1507. So imagine saying, well, I think I've nearly completed it. And it's still like 9 years away. Frederick Nolan, and so I actually read that before. So while Erasmus... that's the interesting thing I wanted to read. So I'll just read through these other ones, and then I'll read that last. While Erasmus was in Italy, he spent most of his time devouring the libraries. You don't think he went to the Vatican Library? You don't think he saw Vaticanus? States Durant, comparing two codices, so I actually read that before. When he went back to Basel to work on printing his Greek New Testament, he arrived, quote, weighed down with books and copious notes on the New Testament, because you can't take those manuscripts out of the libraries, but you certainly can write your own notations. And so let's listen to this. This just shows that the whole thing of 6 manuscripts or 5 manuscripts is just a joke. In fact, Erasmus's own collection was so large and valuable, it was covetously seized by customs when he left England to go to the continent to finalize the Greek New Testament in 1514. He protested that they have stolen the labors of his life. The manuscripts were returned in a few days. So, customs, when he left England, so he's left England and customs have confiscated all of his material. And he's saying, these are the labors of my life. What did he have on him? Well, he obviously had notations and variations and things like that. He had all the notes from all the manuscripts that he'd been going through Europe, writing down. And so anyway, that's some interesting things there. Let's continue.
This man was no slouch when it came to the intellectual ability. We're going to find out that he was as great as or greater a scholar than anyone we've got today.
And so I would just say absolutely way better scholar. I think when you look at Erasmus's works, like a lot of people who are scholars today can just sort of read Erasmus, you know what I mean, and figure those things out. For Erasmus to write these things in the age that he did, he was fluent in Greek, fluent in Latin, and a world-leading expert in both. He was deeply trained in classical literature. He was an expert in manuscripts. So this is one of the things too. Most people today, they've grown up reading books and looking at computers, where to read manuscripts, it's a whole different art form. And so he grew up in the middle of that transition. And so he was part of that transmission of getting manuscripts into print. And the same when he was a proofreader for 7 months with Aldus Manutius, putting those manuscripts into print, that was just part of what they were doing. And so obviously you have to be an expert in manuscripts to do that. And you can spot things in manuscripts. You're reading along, you see a mistake. Someone, maybe a scribe's put a little dot there to let you know it's a mistake, or you're reading along and you can tell it, just the grammar has gone sideways, and it's like, hang on, there's something wrong here. And he knew all Greek as well. He knew classical Greek. He knew Koine Greek. He knew the Byzantine Greek. He knew the modern Greek that they were speaking at the time. And so he was engaged with the primary sources constantly. So it wasn't just a little side project for him. This was something that he was constantly involved with. And so we're dealing with one of the top intellectuals of Europe. And so it's not just someone fumbling through text, or just some hack who just has a bit of a brainstorm and says, hey, I'm going to just do the New Testament. He's been planning this for years and years and years, and preparing himself for the task. And so
from there, he went to Bologna. He probably stopped in Florence, although the documentation doesn't say that, but it's in a direct line between Venice, Bologna, and Rome. And then when he went to Rome, because he was a priest, he had access to any monastery he wanted to go to, any monastery library, including the Vatican Library.
So this is one of the things that when I listened to this, I was like, yes, he's saying it. Because I remember, I've been saying this for quite a few years now, and you sort of feel alone when you're saying this. And a lot of people have pushed back on it. Oh, no, he never saw Vaticanus. And I'm like, how do you know that? Like, he went to the Vatican Library, and he obviously knew about this manuscript because he had Bombasius write to him. And later on, Sepultiva, he wrote to him as well and gave him 365 readings from it that he had requested. And so he obviously knew about it. So to me, even though historically it doesn't say that he saw it, I mean, it's a bit like going to Disneyland and not seeing Mickey Mouse. I mean, it's like, well, surely he would have gone there. And this manuscript was seen, it was sort of revered by Bombasius and by Sepultiva for them to do the work that they did to give Erasmus the information that he wanted on it. So what did they just forget that it was there? Or I've often said that this story is like, imagine Erasmus, he walks up the stairs to the Vatican Library and he's like, oh, there's the room with Codex Vaticanus in it. He goes to go in there, but then a green gas just started pouring out like an old 1960s Batman scene with Batman and Robin, and he falls on the ground and starts frothing at the mouth. And then he wakes up and it's like, oh, what happened? And he's outside and it's like, oh, I can't see that manuscript. He tried again, but the green gas came again. It's, why wouldn't he see this? There's no reason. It's only just really because they want to make out that Westcott and Hort had sort of like this exclusive access to Vaticanus. And this is the new, obviously, Vaticanus was simply just mostly rejected and ignored after it's been rejected, seen as, Erasmus said it could have been a back translation from a Latin document. He toyed with the idea of it being written in the Council of Florence. That was in 1439, sorry. saying that it could have been written then. It's back translation from a Latin document. Even John Mill in 1707 was voicing similar concerns about it. And so then we've got to have this story sort of like, well, Erasmus never looked at it, because or else he would have seen the importance of it. Because really, ultimately, where was the critical text Bible during all this time? It's just basically Vaticanus. And so, like, Sinaiticus is just unknown to history up until 1844. And so there's really no text. There's no competing texts. There are Byzantine texts, and that's it. And a few little spatterings of Codex Beza and a few other, Claromontanus. There's a few little different things around, like Codex Alexandrinus ends up, being given to King James, and Charles accepted that, and that's what the Walton Polyglot, they went through that sort of stuff. But ultimately, around this period, it's like, where's the critical text? It's not being used. No one's printing it. It's just a weird thing. The main thing is the Byzantine, and the main thing is the Textus Receptus. And so there just is no critical text. They didn't have a Bible. Their Bible, when they're critiquing us and saying, oh, which TR edition? At least it's like watching a horse race and they're critiquing one of the horses. They don't even have a horse in the race. We own all the horses. You know what I mean? They've all been trained by TR people, and yes, some of them are donkeys and they're running last. Some of them are running first, like Beza's is running first, and Erasmus is a very important one. But it's like, at the end of the day, they don't even have a horse in the race for like 1,000 years, for longer. Well, they're claiming, like 1,500 years of just silence for their text. So that just doesn't match up with what the Bible says. The Bible says the word of God will be accessible to the people. How can you be judged according to the words that come out of Jesus's mouth if you don't have them? The Bible says in the book of Revelation, don't add and don't subtract from these words. How can you try and avoid doing that if you don't know where the words are? It's impossible. And so Hudson is in the house, living the dream, and so is Hilly Billy. So these guys are just loving the Erasmus chat and loving this video. So I'll continue on.
And the Vatican Library is where the guys in Spain got their Greek texts.
Yeah, that's a very important point, because the guys who did the Complutensian Polyglot didn't bother with Vaticanus. Isn't that interesting? They didn't like it either. But by the looks of it, I mean, if it's such a beautiful thing, why isn't anyone keeping it? It's like the story of someone described promiscuous girls. They're like the top piece of bread on a loaf of bread. Everyone touches it, but no one wants to really eat it. You know what I mean? You go past it and you grab the others. How come the Complutensian guys weren't using Vaticanus? How come when you get to Erasmus, he's looking at it, he's examining, doing due diligence? Like what an amazing scholar to look at all that, but then go, no, it's an aberration. It's got weird readings in it, and he's rejecting it. And so he's saying it's probably a back translation from a Latin document. Now, this is the main pillar of modern Bibles. And so anyway, very interesting. And that's why I really enjoyed listening to this video by Steve Coombs. When I listened to this, I was like, man, this is really good. Heffin Jones says, nope, it's evening in Sydney too. So we've got good evening and good morning, everyone else. And so, yes, but he's being specific. It's evening. There you go. Subscribe to Revolution. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Yeah, thanks, Hilly. Yeah, so usually Heffin Jones is in the Philippines, but he is in Australia doing his thing. Hudson says, So why is it the two lines of manuscripts theory that the King James Bible defenders tried to defend is, this is why it's a non-starter? Yes, the critical text doesn't even have a line of manuscripts. Yeah, and that's the thing. It's like, well, we've got the Alexandrian line and the thing is, like, saying, oh, they're Alexandrian, like Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are so different from each other. In the Gospels alone, Hoskia pointed out there was over 3,000 differences. It's like 3,047 or something. And he didn't compile, or he didn't collate those manuscripts like he did with others, because he's got books about Bible collation. And there were 17 types of analysis that he didn't use, where if he had used those other 17 types of analysis, it would have ended up being thousands and thousands of differences between Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, up way above the 3,000. It would have probably been like 10,000s, maybe 20, 30. And so that oftentimes what you'll find is what are labeled Alexandrian manuscripts are just sort of like everything else other than Byzantine. I know you've had the Western and Caesarean, but I mean, most people don't even talk about that sort of stuff now with the CBGM. But Byzantine manuscripts are scrutinized harsher than Alexandrian texts are, because people know that there's a lot more difference in Alexandrian texts. So if you were to go into all the fine little details like you did with the Byzantine text, you would be there forever. And so they actually have a different way of tabulating those, which is quite interesting.
So he was constantly on the move. Now, I'm going to go backwards just a moment. What I want to show you next is that when he went to all these cities all over Europe, he was constantly rummaging through libraries, constantly looking in monasteries for old manuscripts. He would get a hold of friends and say, do you know any old New Testament manuscripts? Can you get them for me? From 1504 to 1515, that's what his whole career was when it comes to the New Testament. He was looking all through these cities. So what did he find? Well, I went back to try to find that out.
Okay, so before Steve Coombs talks about his research into Erasmus and what he had access to and what he's could have had access to, I'm just going to tell you just quickly that I've done a few videos on this. And so one of the first videos that I did on this was the sack of Rome in 1527, that Rome was actually sacked. And so it was the Spanish and the Lutherans went into Rome. Many people were killed, bodies in the streets, libraries set on fire, this type of thing. And so if you actually look at the Renaissance, oftentimes we're looking at Florence, and we might look at other places where this is, begun, but Rome became like the center for Renaissance up until 1527. And so basically, if you had access to manuscripts in Rome before 1527, that there's a great possibility that you saw manuscripts there that, like Erasmus, if he saw things 20 years later, those manuscripts were not available. And so it's very important to know that we're actually leaking out manuscripts throughout history. It's people are writing them, yes, and putting them together, but they're later, usually, in the Byzantine era. What we see with like Rome and with England in the libraries, many of these manuscripts were lost. And so, Dan Wallace talks about the loss of manuscripts in World War II, let alone World War I and a whole bunch of other European wars. But so I've done a video on the sack of Rome, but also I've done a video on the disillusionment of the monasteries in England, because Erasmus went to England 3 times. And he was, scouring the libraries, looking at stuff there as well. And in 1540, a lot of those monasteries were just dissolved. And so Henry VIII had enough of it all, and he just said, let's just go in there. and just take out what's valuable. But sometimes this led to places being ransacked, and people with testimonies of Bible manuscripts just lying all out in the street in the mud. People in the local market selling fish wrapped up in Bible manuscripts, this type of thing. And so imagine that. It's like, oh, there's a bit of Vaticanus, or, it's like wrapped up, you got a bit of fish there to eat for the night. And so this sort of thing was happening throughout Europe. You're talking about the times of Luther. Like, if you've ever watched that Luther movie, if you haven't watched it, I would recommend you do watch it, because sometimes I'm thinking back on those days, and I do think about that movie quite a lot. It is a very powerful, like, visual thing to see, certain things. And I guess it's just, sometimes it's like watching a Jesus movie. You see him going and healing things. Some things are a bit daggy, but other things you're like, yeah, that's powerful. That's really good. And when you're reading scriptures, sometimes that can put a picture in your mind of how things were. But you're looking at the time when Luther was there. Lots of wars were happening. Lots of places, like Germany, was turned upside down. There was a 30-year war. And so what would have been happening to Bible manuscripts? People would have been stealing them. Yeah, a lot of churches were just turned upside down. And so things were burnt, things were destroyed. And who had access to all of that stuff before all the horrible things happened? It was people like Erasmus, who went to England, he went to Rome, went to Venice. And some of these places, like, were sacked as well, like later on. And many times places were burnt, libraries are burnt, even in England, because the Renaissance stopped in Rome in 1527 after the sack of Rome. But you look in England around the time of King James, Shakespeare and all that's a Renaissance. There's a huge movement there. And then in 1666, I think it was, that was when the fire happened of England, of London, where 437 acres of London burnt to the ground. I mean, imagine trying to stop a fire like that without modern day technology of hoses and pumps and all the rest of it. And so there was the Guildford Hall filled with all the information about the King James Bible, and it burnt to the ground. Like, they created a library about the King James Bible, and only like 50 years later, it burnt to the ground, and it's just ash. So imagine them talking about where they documented things, and the writings of Lancelot Andrewes and Stephen Boyce. What's his name? Jonathan Boyce. I said Stephen Boyce. That's a bit of a funny slip of the tongue. Like, Henry Saville. Like, a lot of works were there. And so, very, very interesting time of history. And it was interesting going down that rabbit hole. And I guess I still haven't finished going down that rabbit hole. And just looking at when there are periods of time when there was a destruction of manuscripts, because people are like, well, what we've got in our hand today, that's all that matters. And it's like, no, Erasmus was talking about manuscripts. We have no idea what he's talking about. The same as Beza. Like, look at the Revelation 16:5 thing. Beza said he had an old ancient manuscript of good report. Where is that? Who knows about that today? No one has any idea. And so until we really study more and probably read all Erasmus's annotations, we won't know. And so there's a lot of manuscripts that are just lost in time. Heffern Jones says, Hilly Billy, all good. I'm in Australia permanently these days. Might have to say night to you and all before too long. Come back and replay later. Thanks for joining us, Heffern. Everyone's just loving that. Good morning. I'm on coffee too. I need to be burning diesel on the tractor. So that sounds fun. And Bold is having your mango ginger moringa tea. There you go. Hilly's having a good dust bath. And yeah, so they're just all chatting there. Let's continue.
And when I had been in that Sunday school class I mentioned to you, and I raised my hand and I said Erasmus had many more manuscripts than that, the teacher said, "Do you have a list?" And I did not have a list. So I decided I would get a list. And it turned out that I had to make a list. So there are about 3,000 ancient manuscripts of what we call minuscule. Minuscule. That's lowercase Greek letters. The oldest manuscripts that we have are written in uppercase letters. And if you have a desire to be a Greek scholar, which I don't recommend, you might know that that's called uncial manuscripts or majuscule. But anyway, there are 3,000 of these lowercase manuscripts. Now, I didn't have the time to look through all 3,000, so I decided to look through the first 250. And I looked at the history of these manuscripts to find out which manuscripts were in these cities when Erasmus was in these cities, and were they available to him? And I found many of them that were. So let's just take a look at some of those. In Paris, France, there were 21 manuscripts. In Oxford, England, there were 3 manuscripts. In Leicester, England, there was 1 manuscript. And by the way, he took 3 trips to England. And he boiled down to years that he spent in England. In London, England, there were 2 manuscripts. And by the way, these are still there. And if you want to go look at them, I suppose you can see them. Vienna, Austria, there was 1 manuscript. In Bologna, Italy, there was 1 manuscript. In Rome, Italy, there were at least 5 manuscripts, and very likely there were many, many more. And he had access to all of them. And you know what else was in Rome when he was there? One particular manuscript was there, which is the darling of all critical scholars today, and considered to be the oldest and the best manuscript. Anybody want to jump at a guess as to what that was? Vaticanus. It was in Rome, Italy, when he was there. And we'll talk more about Vaticanus in just a minute. Excuse me, I went backwards, didn't I? Okay, and then in Basel, Switzerland, there was the 8 manuscripts that I mentioned before. And when he did his 2nd to 5th editions of the Greek New Testament, he found at least 6 more to add to that. Well, how many do you reckon that is? Let me go back. You know, I can handle a computer, I just can't handle this. That was 48 manuscripts that were available to Erasmus in the libraries and the monasteries where he was in cities where he was searching diligently for manuscripts. 48 manuscripts. But that's not all. It doesn't end there. When he was in, he had to leave Paris in the early 1500s because of the Black Plague, and he went here and there, kind of running away from the Black Plague. No sense in exposing yourself to it, right? So he spent a long time in Belgium, and when he was there, he ran across a manuscript by another fellow by the name of Lorenzo Valla. Now, Lorenzo Valla had written notes on the New Testament in 2 volumes. He had published the first volume. He didn't publish the second volume, but Erasmus found the second volume. And basically what Valla did was to take 4 Latin Vulgate manuscripts and 4 Greek New Testament manuscripts and compare them And he found the Vulgate to be very, very corrupt. And all total, he wrote 2,000 notes on verses in the New Testament. Erasmus found and used his material, and the second volume Erasmus published. And not only that, but Erasmus said that Valla had 7 manuscripts that contained the book of 1 John, especially chapter 5. And that he himself had seen 8 such manuscripts. So he doesn't describe which manuscripts those were, but he makes it plain when he is being criticized for only having 1 or 2 manuscripts with 1 John, and that's why he didn't put 1 John 5:7 in his first and second editions. Erasmus said, no, I had many manuscripts. I had many. And I couldn't put something in when I couldn't find it in the Greek manuscript. Well, he finally found one, a codex, which is a book form of the Greek New Testament. He found it, and he put 1 John 5:7 in his third edition. So Lorenzo Valla used those 4 manuscripts plus the 7 other manuscripts and wrote 2,000 notes, which Erasmus was able to access.
So, yeah, good information. There's really not much I disagree with that. I think it's very well said. And so, yeah, 1 John 5:7, I would just say for people who are studying this and want to go a bit further with 1 John 5:7, just all you have to do is examine what Erasmus said in his own annotations in 1 John 5:7. You're best to go to his 5th edition where he has a whole bunch of stuff where he's talking about 1 John 5:7 rather than just his earlier editions where it's smaller. It grew over the years. And if you compare what's being said in Greek compared to Montfortianus, which they say is what he used, there's variation there, and there shouldn't be any variation, and there's words missing. And so I think that's proof that Montfortianus is not Codex Britannicus that Erasmus talks about. So I think it's important to think about that. And that's something where I'm often studying this type of stuff, but I'm just throwing it out there and saying, hey, there are holes in the story that the critical text guys are saying that I think we really need to pursue, we need to think about, and we need to document. I guess he was talking about Lorenzo Valla. What you see too, all the way through Erasmus's annotations, even in his first edition, say in Revelation, he'll talk, I think it's in Revelation chapter 6, I think it is, he talks about a codex, I think he calls it like Valentinus or something like that, where it's talking about Lorenzo Valla's annotation. So he's using that and he's calling it in his codex or in his book. So he's saying his studies basically have this type of reading. So he's specifically talking about Lorenzo Valla there. And so when people say, oh, you only have 1 manuscript for the book of Revelation, that's another thing that needs to be questioned, because perhaps you've got to read it in its context and go, perhaps he had 1 manuscript with that type of Andreas commentary in it. Perhaps because he does say he had plural Greek manuscripts in the book of Revelation. In his annotations, he says that. So they're like, no, he only had 1 manuscript, and here it is. And I'm like, no, that manuscript doesn't match up. It doesn't make any sense that he can spot homoioteiton in Revelation 22:19 if it's missing in that manuscript either. And then it's just like, well, Erasmus lied, of course, and he was just a bozo. They just start making up excuses instead of just going, yeah, that doesn't match up, and we should really go from that type of erroneous teaching and develop more factual, more truthful theories. And so,
then there was a guy that he met in Venice, and that guy's name was Janus Laskarius. He was a Greek.
okay, so I'm going to look this guy up. So it's Janus Laskarius. Okay, here we go. We've got a Wikipedia article on the guy. Here he is. He's a wild-looking character. Okay, he's a Greek, Janus Laskarios from Constantinople. He died about the same time as Erasmus in Rome. He was a noted Greek scholar in the Renaissance. After the fall of Constantinople, Laskarios was taken to the Peloponnese and to Crete. When still quite young, he came to Venice, where Bessarion became his patron. So this is an interesting link, because this is Bessarion, someone who I've studied into a bit and talked about him in the Byzantine Academy videos that I've done, where Bessarion became his patron and sent him to learn Latin at the University of Padua. On his death, Lorenzo de Medici, so the Medicis were a very powerful family in Florence, welcomed him to Florence, where Laskarius gave Greek lectures on Thucydides and all those other fancy Greek names that I won't mention. He sent him to get Greek manuscripts. When he returned the second time, he brought back about 200 from Mount Athos, which is very interesting. Meanwhile, Lorenzo had died. That's the De Medici guy, or this fancy-looking guy here. Laskarius entered the service of the Kingdom of France and was ambassador to Louis the 12th at the time. So this is around the time of, I guess, Machiavelli. You got a lot of really top-notch scholars in Europe, in Florence, working for the Medicis and this type of thing. But I'm more interested in the manuscripts. So Lorenzo sent him twice to Greek in a quest of manuscripts. When he returned the second time, he brought about 200 from Mount Athos. So that's huge. Okay. So let's keep going down. During his stay in Venice, he became a member of the new academy. So that's the Byzantine Academy that I talk about in my videos, of Aldus Manutius. So he would have probably met with Erasmus, I guess. But if the printer had benefit of his service, no Aldine work bears his name. He resided at Rome under Leo X, the first pope of the Medici family from 1513 to 1518, etc. So I'm just looking for anything to do with like Erasmus or other Greek issues. No, so it's just sort of a basic history about him. But there he is anyway. So interesting guy. And it's interesting that he was, Bessarion was his patron, because he's Bessarion. Okay. Now, this is the guy that I talk about quite a lot. He died in 1472. So this is like, 10 years sort of after Erasmus was born. Like Erasmus was like 10 years old. Okay. So he's a Byzantine Greek Renaissance humanist. Humanist in a sense where he goes back to the original sources. And you can see that he collected manuscripts. And, obviously he's going through, Pythagorean concepts, Plato's concepts, a whole bunch of other things. And when we go down to his library, so he had a center for learned Greek and Greek refugees, whom he supported by commissioning transcripts of Greek manuscripts and translations into Latin that made Greek scholarship available to Western Europeans. So very interesting. And I want to get back to his library that he had. Works. Okay, so I'm going to just type in library. It was thanks to him that the Bibliotheca, an important compendium of Greek mythology, has survived to the present. His library, which contained a very expensive collection of Greek manuscripts, was presented by him in 1568 to the Senate of the Republic of Venice and formed the nucleus of the famous Library of St. Mark's, the Bibliotheca Marciana. It was comprised of 482 Greek and 264 Latin manuscripts. Most of Bessarion's works are in Migne Patrologia Graeca. So that is the work by a Roman Catholic priest, but it's actually a very important work of, I think he wrote that in like 1860 or something like that, but it contains lots and lots of material. But yeah, basically he has his own sort of library. I should really continue on to see. Now that's all that's sort of written about him, but I just sort of read about Bessarion because when Erasmus was in Venice, this library had already been around for years. So, and it's not like it's a hidden exclusive thing. It's just an open library. It comprised of 482 Greek and 264 Latin manuscripts. Now, I'm not saying they're all biblical. They say that, you know, Greek mythology and stuff like that was the core, but just say there's 100 there that he has access to, or 10 or whatever. That blows out the door the whole, oh, he only had access to 5 manuscripts that someone like Dan Wallace would say. And so it would be great. I'm pretty sure even Heffin Jones went through that material because we were chatting. I think I asked him about that when he was on my program. And later on, he sort of said, I think there's this many biblical manuscripts. And maybe I should just ask Grok or someone. I'll see if I can ask Grok. I'll just say, how many biblical manuscripts did Bessarion have? Let's get his name here. Okay. How many biblical manuscripts in Greek and also Latin did Bessarion have in the library in Venice? Let's check this out. Okay, so just thinking a little bit. Okay, going through some articles. Cardinal Bessarion, a Greek scholar, just explaining who he is. The initial 1468 shipment or legal transfer included 482 Greek manuscripts and 264 Latin books or manuscripts for a total of 746 items. Later inventories and additions, including items sent after his death in 1472, so this is still before Erasmus was in Venice, brought the total collection associated with the donation to roughly 1,000 to 1,150 items, with over 600 Greek manuscripts overall and several hundred Latin ones. Exact figures vary slightly across early inventories due to ongoing transfers, losses, recataloguing, but the Greek portion was particularly notable as one of the largest collections of its kind in the Latin West at the time. No comprehensive published count exists for the subset of strictly biblical manuscripts, i.e. Bibles, Old or New Testament, Gospels, Psalters, etc. Within Bessarion's donation, the library focused heavily on classical Greek literature, philosophy, science, patristic theology, so early church writings, to preserve Byzantine heritage, along with scholastic Latin works. Biblical items were present, but not the dominant category. Known biblical manuscripts from Bessarion's collection in the Marciana. Several notable examples include, and so it's got Old Testament with the beginning of Job, a companion to Vaticanus Graecus 2106. So many manuscripts are called Vaticanus just because they're in the Vatican. We just know Vaticanus as it's actually got a number after it, but we usually don't say the number. So when it says Vaticanus Graecus, it doesn't mean that it's part of Vaticanus. It looks like a Old Testament in Greek. There's another one, 10th to 11th century Psalter, Katina on Job, 905 AD. Another one compiled, a complete Greek Bible compiled in the late 15th century for Bessarion under his patronage by a scribe associated with him, anonymous Velta Tau George Tisgrambolopoulos. So I have never heard of that. This is like gold. This is so good. Who is this guy who did a whole Bible, a whole Greek Bible? I've never heard of the guy. So there's just so much. You start getting into this stuff, and it just opens up. Okay. It includes the New Testament. Okay, so let me just put in New Testament. Now, it looks like there are people named that today, so that's confusing it. But that will be some homework to do. That's amazing. That Bessarion basically had a New Testament made in Greek. Okay. But I don't know about that. I know about Manetti's one that was 70 years before Erasmus, and he used Greek and Latin manuscripts for that. But I don't know about this one. This is an anonymous New Testament, okay, in the 15th century. No, a complete Greek Bible. And so, yeah, so obviously that was done in the 15th century. So it might have been like 1450 or something like that. And this other guy has put it into a modern situation around that time. The Greek New Testament manuscripts include associated with Family One and the Venice Group, GA 205 and others were owned by Bessarion. So there were things that Erasmus could have had access to. And the thing is, too, he still had access to Aldus Manutius. They were good friends. And he talks about that as well in his annotations and other works, talking about 1 John 5:7 and Revelation 22. Works by Thomas Aquinas. Interesting. So, yeah, there's a lot of interesting information there. And I'm going to save that. I could just sit here and just do a full study for trying to find this New Testament that was done in like the 15th century. That's amazing. I don't know about that. What was it? Have we got a copy of it today? There's so many interesting things about that. Okay, so let's continue. So that just basically all came from looking at this Janius Lascarius. Okay, so let's see what Dr. Coombs has found out about that.
Had come to Italy, and in 1492, Lorenzo Medici sent him to Greece. He had made one trip earlier, but this one he went to Mount Athos, where a monastery was, a Greek Orthodox monastery. He went there and he brought back 200 manuscripts from Mount Athos. He brought them into Florence, Italy. And unfortunately, due to difficulties, they had Rome, but that didn't matter because he was in Testaments. But some of them were. At least, it looks like from my study, at least 4 that are in the Medici library right now. So when Erasmus went to Venice, he met Janus Lascarius. And that guy no doubt told him about these manuscripts. Another man that Erasmus met was a man by the name of George Hieronymus. Now he was a Greek too.
Okay, George Hieronymus. Let's check that out. Okay. And I'll type in Erasmus. Okay, so there's a Britannica article on this. Oh no, that's Esma. Doesn't look like a George, does it? I don't think it's him. Anyway, I'll continue on.
From Greece, came in to teach at the University of Paris. And this man right here was one of Erasmus' early Greek teachers. Now, funny thing about George Hieronymus, he was also a manuscript copyist. He was a scribe. And he himself had copied out 5 New Testament Greek manuscripts. And here he is teaching Erasmus. You think Erasmus didn't know about those manuscripts? Well, take another guess. He learned about them. And then I had mentioned to you the Complutensian polyglot that was going on, which Erasmus was.
So this George Hieronymus, I can't find much information about him online. I guess that'll be another project that I'll do. One thing that I really enjoyed when I was going through this, there were names that I'd never heard of. And for him to have done 5 manuscripts and to have met, to have collated 5 manuscripts and to have met with Erasmus, no doubt they would have compared notes and talked about things. And so, yeah, very interesting tidbit of information. I guess that's going to be a rabbit trail for me one day to go through these names and add them to the Byzantine Academy group of videos that I've been doing.
Was able to use for his later editions because it was finally published in 1522. So these are things that Erasmus was able to find. And when we look at the manuscripts and the criticisms that are made, we find that these manuscripts, although they were dated late, except for one, maybe, they were traditional text manuscripts. And by the way, they all totaled at least 58 manuscripts. But they were traditional text manuscripts. And traditional text manuscripts are manuscripts which, if you look at some of my videos in previous years, I have traced the manuscripts all the way back to the 1st century.
And so that's where I've done a video critiquing Steve Combs on that with P52, and he made a claim in a video, and so I went, okay, let's have a look at this. So we went through the Greek, and it was like, oh, actually, it agrees with the Westcott and Hort text here. And so I think, that sort of information really, I guess, it wasn't like after I'd done my video, I think Dwayne Green did a video after that And this type of information was just, I think a lot of people just agreed you couldn't go with that information. And so that's where, in this video, I'm pretty much in like 95% agreement with everything he's saying. But I sort of think that some of these videos that are out there really need to be critiqued. I don't know if internally with the King James Bible Research Council whether they critique each other's stuff, but I know that some of the guys there know about my video on it, and it's not just to bash them. I mean, I say things that I get things wrong all the time, and I listen back years later and go, oh, actually no, I wasn't saying that correctly, or and so so I would just say he's saying to go and check that out, to the first century. I would just say I think that's been found wanting. And I just went through the first one and P52 and that was wanting. And so I was like, well, I'm not really going to bother going with these other ones. But Dwayne Green went through them. And even though he's a Byzantine guy, he's not a TR guy or a King James guy, I went through them I listened through that series and I went, that the other ones are pretty much in the same league as well. And so I don't think it was really a strong defense for the TR whatsoever. And so anyway, that's my 5 cents. Like I said, most of the things I'm in agreement here, but just every now and then there's something I'm like, not in agreement with that.
They are the vast majority of manuscripts. At least 92 or 93% of all Greek manuscripts are traditional text. And if a text is original, and God therefore is blessing it because it is original, then it would just naturally be the one that is most often copied. And then there were, I always have my finger in the wrong place. There were the so-called church fathers. And by the way, they're always called church fathers, these guys who wrote things back in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century, 4th century. I don't like calling them fathers because Jesus said, call no man on earth your father. So that's why I put it in quotes. These so-called church fathers wrote many things and they quoted the scriptures hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. Well, guess what? Erasmus studied the church fathers. He even wrote a commentary on Jerome, a 5th century father, a Roman Catholic guy who translated the Latin Vulgate. But he studied these guys and these quotes going all the way back at least to the 3rd century. So you can't accuse Erasmus of having only late manuscripts to work with. He knew everything Bruce Metzger knew when he helped to edit the United Bible Society's Greek text.
So I would say, like the vast majority, like I'm in agreement with what he's saying. I guess it's just the way it's being said. Like he knew everything that Bruce Metzger, because then also someone has to do is go, well, did he know about this Sinaiticus reading that's a bit rare and it ends up in the text or whatever? And so obviously he didn't know about that, and then it's not everything. And so, but the vast majority of issues were well known, and they were known by Erasmus. They were known by people in the Reformation period. But then when Sinaiticus came along, it had some other weird sort of readings, and Codex Alexandrinus had come along that was given to King James as a gift. But yeah, these had some weird readings, and so I guess that's where Bruce Metzger was a smart guy. He knew his Latin very well educated guy, but he's obviously on the other team. So it's a bit like, some Jehovah's Witnesses are very, very well educated. They know their stuff, but they've got a barrow to push with their Kingdom Hall and, the doctrines that come out of that, and the Watchtower magazines and the 12 prophets in New York and all that sort of stuff. So to me, someone like Bruce Metzger, he is educated to his eyeballs in the teachings of the academy, but yeah, he's lacking in a lot of areas. Yeah, so that's I know there's a tiny bit of pushback here on a few things, but there's really not that much pushback. Like I said, I'm in agreement with 95% of what he's saying.
And he was just as great a scholar, and he had access to Vaticanus. After he put out his first edition, Erasmus was criticized from daylight to dark by Roman Catholics. He had a guy named Sepulveda sending him quotes from Vaticanus, quote after quote after quote. He had Paulus Bombasius, the librarian of the Vatican Library, sending him any variant reading in Vaticanus that he wanted. He was very...
So just to tidy that up, I would say Sepulveda was doing that. Bessarion gave him information on 1 John 5:7 specifically. Sorry, not Bessarion, Bombasius, sorry. And so he had lived with Bombasius in Bologna for 13 months. But yeah, it was Sepulveda who had given him the 365 variants and readings from Vaticanus. And so, yeah, just to really tidy that up, it's not really a big deal.
Familiar with Vaticanus, and when he studied Vaticanus, he said, this thing is corrupt, and he rejected it. He didn't use it. So, how good is the Textus Receptus? How good is the Textus Receptus? Well, let me remind you that in Matthew chapter 7, verse 20, Jesus said, wherefore by their fruits ye shall know them. Well, look around and think about what's happened to the church and to Christianity and to the morality of Western culture in the 20th century and now the 21st. We have gotten so bad, we don't even know what a woman is. I saw a discussion on one campus yesterday or day before, I think it was the day before, between Charlie Kirk and this young lady who came up to argue with him, and he asked her what was a woman. And she said, are you talking about sex? Sex and gender are different. Really? Gender was always male and female. Sex is male and female. And by the way, gender has to do with grammar, not people. At least that's the way it used to be. Things are changing. But you know what has presided over this downfall and this decay? When did it start, folks? It started in the early 20th century. And what happened in 1881? The Revised Version was published in England. What happened in 1901? The American Standard Version was, which is the Revised Version, pretty much the same. It was published in America. And we have had hundreds of new English translations, all published in the 20th and 21st centuries, all the while our lives and our moral culture go to the devil. They have made no impact on any of that to raise people's morality. As a matter of fact, we have Christians now who don't think fornication is a sin. And mainly, maybe that's because the new Bibles don't call it fornication anymore. They just say immorality, which depends on how you define immorality. But anyway, when the Textus Receptus was printed, the fruits were entirely different. The Reformation was caused and fueled by the Textus Receptus, an Erasmus text. Erasmus published that text, and they say, you know, that the Reformation started the following year in 1517 when the old priest in Wittenberg, Martin Luther, came out and nailed the 95 Theses on the door of his church, and people read it, and suddenly the fight was on. I personally beg to differ. The Reformation started in 1516 when the Textus Receptus was published. God always starts things with his word. And Erasmus, for 10 years before that, he had been writing things that criticized the monastic monks. He just ripped them open and examined their hearts and their lives and left them found wanting. In his writings, he did that. And in his New Testament, when he published it, in his preface and in his notes, he continued that work. And so and it wasn't just the monks, it was the bishops and the traditions and the theology of the church. He tore into all of it. And when Martin Luther got started, the monks said, the trouble with Martin Luther was he was a firebrand. He went around setting everything on fire. And the monks said, Erasmus laid the egg and Martin Luther hatched it. Well, you know what Erasmus said about that? He said Erasmus laid a hen. Luther hatched a fighting rooster. That's what Erasmus said about it. And it was true. And you know, they went around saying, Erasmus, condemn Luther. Erasmus, condemn Luther. And Erasmus said, no, I'm not going to condemn Luther. And he wrote to them, and he said, if you want to fight Luther, you fight him on the basis of reasonable arguments and Scripture. And that's what Martin Luther told them. He said, if you can show me I'm wrong by Scripture, I will recant. Well, that wasn't the only thing that happened. The Reformation wasn't the only thing that happened afterwards. There was an explosion of Bible translating, an absolute explosion.
And so I guess, what he's been talking about, the influence on culture, would there be a few things I would say a tiny bit differently? Probably. But that's just, personalities. And and I guess the thing is, the explosion of Bible translations. I mean, we have, Erasmus doing his work, then Tyndale. Like, when you look at what Tyndale did, he translated some of the works of Erasmus, like the one about the Christian soldier, into English, and did the New Testament Greek text into English. And basically, England had revival. They had a full Reformation there. And you can trace it back to that. So it's almost like if you just got Erasmus's material and translated it into English, like, it would have a massive impact on that society. And so it's quite amazing. And Erasmus, a lot of the sayings that are attributed to Tyndale are actually from Erasmus. Erasmus would say, I think that everyone should have the Bible accessible in their own language, this type of thing. And so he was working on the source text, but people like Luther in the German, Tyndale into English, and that just continued on into the Spanish, into Italian, into a whole bunch of texts. So there's just an explosion of Bible translation work, which of course is basically the cornerstone of European society. And, there's so much that you could say that Erasmus did, and his influence is just absolutely massive. Like, you can't even measure that type of influence. And even people like, I'm not a Calvinist, but people like John Calvin, he was basically just teaching how Erasmus taught things and how he read things. And he was heavily influenced by Erasmus's teachings, even though he would have more agreed with Martin Luther on, predestination and things like that.
That continued on to the present day and hasn't stopped. Martin Luther used Erasmus' second edition to translate the Bible, the New Testament, into German. Tyndale used the third edition to translate the Bible or the New Testament into English. And then there was the Spanish and the French and the Swedish and the Italian, and on and on and on, until all of Europe was filled with the Word of God. That's what happened. And then there was an explosion of evangelism. People began to preach the Word of God and preach salvation by grace through faith without works. Christ alone, grace alone, Scripture alone. It didn't happen until Erasmus published his first edition in 1516. There was a few lone voices and small voices throughout the Middle Ages, and they were more likely to end up burning on the end of a stake than to start a church movement. There was an explosion of evangelism, and that was followed by an explosion of worldwide missions. Missions that went to the ends of the earth. And they took the Textus Receptus, and in most cases, the King James Bible. And if not the King James, it was a translation of the Textus Receptus.
And that's so true. The early Bible societies, British and foreign Bible societies, they worked off the Textus Receptus for 100 years. And they were to produce Bibles in all languages that were akin to the King James. And so if it was an Italian Bible, like say Christopher Yetzer, who was in the chat earlier, he's documented that the Bible societies were saying, can you match up the readings that are in the Italian Bible to the King James? So that's what the Bible societies used to do. They used to create King James editions in every language. So no wonder, you know, after Westcott and Hort, they've overthrown the Textus Receptus. It's like, oh, King James is stupid. And so they got all this mess now.
And then there was an explosion of Bible education. And folks, we have more Bibles right now than we can shake a stick at. I don't have room. We're talking about Bible, or I think it was Josh that said that he had Bibles all over his shelf, his bookshelf. There are more Bibles out there than I got room for in all my house. And yet we live in an age of the most hideous ignorance of the Bible. We are as bad as the people of the Middle Ages who were not allowed to read anything but a Latin Bible. And most of them didn't know Latin. So what can we say? Erasmus had all the access to everything you got access to. He had all the manuscripts he needed. And by the way, just suppose for a minute that God had given Erasmus one manuscript. Just suppose that he didn't have access to 58 manuscripts and much more material beyond that. He only had one. Did God suddenly lose his mind? Did God suddenly lose his power? God could have given Erasmus that one exact, perfect manuscript that the Lord preserved and gave it to Erasmus. If that's how God had wanted to do it, God could do it. If all Erasmus had was 5 manuscripts, then they were 5 manuscripts God gave him, and it was God working out his plan in history, and God's plan is perfect, and he works it out perfectly because he is a perfect God.
Hello, and thank you for watching. On behalf of the King James Bible Research Council, we truly appreciate your support of this channel. If this content has been an encouragement to you, we invite you to subscribe and share this channel, as well as follow us on our other social media platforms. If you would like to support the mission and the work of the KJBRC, you can find a donation link at kjbrc.org. There, you'll also find a growing collection of articles, videos, books, and resources to help strengthen your research into this important subject. God bless you. Thank you for watching.
Okay, so that's pretty much it for looking at that issue. Now, I'm going to read through some of the comments that are on here. There's only 12. This is really great work. It surely is, Matt. I want to read all about Erasmus now. Can you make a recommendation? P.S. Your channel is a blessing to me. Okay, so this is Matt Powell official. Okay, haven't heard of him. I'll just check that out. Okay, talking about creation, evolution, SDAs. Okay, looks like an interesting channel. And so I might, oh yeah, he's got full debates. I've never heard of the guy, so that would be interesting. Your channel is a blessing to me. Thank you for what you're producing for the glory of God and warning the body of Christ. Then we have Western civilization is collapsing under the weight of fake Bibles, and this guy did a good job of saying so. Yeah, and I think it's amazing the cultural change. Sometimes it's actually the church who is pushing and promoting, like, you know, the whole gender issue. When you look at the influence of someone like Virginia Mollenkott and her influence on the NIV, but then later on onto the gender inclusive dictionary that has influenced like tons of Bibles since then, since you know, early 1980s. You know, these things eventually, like, you know, eventually people are wondering, you know, how come they're saying, you know, we can't call a woman, and, you know, there's transgenderism and all this sort of stuff. Well, this sort of stuff has been in churches for a long time, and it's ended up in Bible versions, which is quite crazy. But unfortunately, that's just what's happened. This guy says, so Erasmus had access to Vaticanus manuscript. This is very significant. Yeah, and things like this need to be known, because they make out that, oh, well, you know, if Erasmus had all the manuscripts that we had today, you know, he would not be a Textus Receptus guy. No, he definitely would be. He would reject those just like he did with Vaticanus. And what else is he rejecting? What? Sinaiticus and maybe Alexandrinus and maybe Ephraemi Rescriptus and just a few other weird documents around the place. Like you look at Theodore Beza, he basically gave Codex Beza, named after him, away to the Cambridge Library and sort of said, like, don't use it. It's not really a good manuscript. And so these guys knew good manuscripts from bad manuscripts. Unfortunately, today the worst manuscripts are now it's just repackaged, and it's like, oh, that's the best now. You know, that's what you need. Great work. I could have listened to the man for another 5 hours. Wow, that's permafrost. This says, yeah, thank you for the lecture. I really enjoyed it. 3 questions. Was this the whole lecture? Where can we go to find the rest? Is it possible to see somewhere the slide screens? I think that would be a good thing to see as well. Is there a book I can buy with this information? I don't think so. I guess probably because this is becoming quite popular, in the next few years, someone will write a few books on this. Hefin Jones. Okay, so this is just an hour ago. Hefin was in the chat earlier. He says, has Dr. Coombs shared his list of manuscripts somewhere accessible? Are his slides that he's referring to available? Thanks. And so I guess that's about it for the comments there. What, yeah, a tiny little bit of pushback is, you know, he defends Erasmus. I think Erasmus is very defendable. But I think there is a tiny bit of overreach in a sense where Erasmus could have had access to a lot of things, okay? But it doesn't mean he did have access to a lot of things. So this is where I guess I've got to check myself too, because, you know, I'm like, well, he was in Rome. Of course he had access to this and to that. The main reason I'm saying he did probably access Vaticanus is because people use that same type of logic to say he didn't access Vaticanus. There's no proof that he did or didn't. And so just as much as weight behind them saying, hey, he didn't, I've got just as much weight saying, yeah, he did. But that's probably like if I leave out the fact that there are people there who just want to keep banging the drum and saying, Erasmus slipped on banana peels and was an idiot. If I really want to just look truly at it, but maybe he didn't. If I'm corrected on that, if they find a document saying that he never saw it or he never went to the Vatican Library, or I think he did. He was in Rome. He would have looked at the best manuscripts. He would have spent time there. That's why he was there. And so, and also like having a good friend like Bombasius, who had access to that, they would have been contacting each other, talking about it. And so, I think, we don't want to be exaggerating. We don't want bad argumentation. We want to be precise on the Textus Receptus. Now, I'm not saying Coombs has done anything that I haven't done, but I guess there is pushback because there are people saying claims to the contrary. And so sometimes we're pushing back on that, but that doesn't make it right either. It doesn't mean he did have access to all these 58 documents or he did look at them, but it doesn't mean that he didn't look at them as well. And so what we're doing is basically we're just putting the information out there and saying, this warrants further investigation. And I think the thing is too, some people's lives are very well documented. And so with Erasmus having so much access to the scholarship of Europe, sometimes it's easier to look at other people who have, a biography or have certain historical facts about them that everyone sort of knew about and you can't refute. And sometimes these people are writing about Erasmus and what people had access to as well. So I think it just opens a door to the problem is people are saying 5 manuscripts only. And what that does, it actually puts blinders on people, or it creates a wall in front of them. So they're walking in a certain direction to study things out. And then there's a wall in front of them that says, no, only 5 manuscripts. And they go, oh, okay, well, I'll study those 5 and move on. There's nothing to see here, where there is a lot to see there. And so we're trying to just pull those walls down. Now, whatever's behind those walls, it's like, okay, it's sort of like for this generation, we're pioneering. But for previous generations, they've done a lot of this type of study. There's a lot of biographies written about Erasmus and what he did and what he had access to and things like that. And so we've really got to go through that material afresh. And so I think this sermon that's been done, this teaching that's been done, is very, very important. And I've been teaching on this because I feel it's an important thing. And I guess hearing someone else talk about all this stuff, I'm like, yes, this is great. And that's why I want to sort of tidy up a few edges, because when people start studying these things, it's good to just hear someone say, look, I've fallen into that pit. I've gone on that side of the road as well. Just try to avoid those issues and stick to, looking at manuscripts, looking at who had access to them, looking at where Erasmus traveled to, looking at his companions. What were they writing? What were they talking about? And I think he did a very good job at pointing out, the associations that Erasmus had, because I think that's a very big thing to examine. And so what was I looking at? I think that's about it. There was one thing that I was thinking of. So access doesn't mean collation. So just because Erasmus could have had access to something or did have an open door to visit something, it doesn't mean that he did. But it doesn't mean that he didn't either. But we've just got to go, okay, well, he might have had a manuscript right next to his head, used it as a pillow, you know what I mean? It doesn't mean he read it. It doesn't mean he didn't read it. We don't know unless he states that. And so now there are some things in logic where you would go, okay, if he's got it in his possession or he visited a library and they had that manuscript there, the chances of him thinking about it and seeing it, it's high. Or like was mentioned, that other guy who had collated 5 manuscripts, that and he met with Erasmus. That would have been talked about. That would have been thought about. And Erasmus probably looked at his work and went over it. And so very interesting video. So anyway, I think I'm going to cut it short, in a sense where we've gone for 2 hours and 37. Usually I go for 4 or 5. The other day I went for nearly 7 hours. It was wild. I'll just go through some of these comments. I think everyone's just sort of chatting there together, so I'll skip over quite a lot of this. Helg says this session by Steve Coombs was certainly better than the former one with P52. Yeah, I don't think anyone was really happy with that one, because I did a live critique of that, because it could have gone either way, and I just kept saying, I think it's going to Westcott Hort. Sorry, and then when Dwayne Green did his video, it was like, yeah, he just solidified that, and he went on to look at all the other claims as well. And so, but yeah, I mean, we can have speakos, we can say things wrong. I guess the thing is, it would be good for that to be retracted. It says Jesus lie but too late shalale or something. It says the gospel, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses 1 to 4. Christ shed his blood on the cross for our sins and was buried and rose again the 3rd day according to the Holy Scriptures. Believe in the gospel, the blood of Jesus. God has reconciled himself with us humans through Jesus Christ. Yes, Jesus died on the cross. He died for our sins. If we put our faith and our trust, our belief in him for our salvation, we will be saved. Whosoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish, but will have everlasting life, which is good news. And so I think on that note, I'll play my outro and I'll leave the stream. But thanks for contributing, guys. And I know this is a weird time for me to do a video like this. But yeah, I just wanted to do it after I saw that this was live and available. Everyone's going to be chatting about this. And so let's continue to promote the Textus Receptus. Okay, I'll play my video and I'll see you guys very soon.